Hi, I'm Adam Porter, and this is Programming Mobile Applications for Android Handheld Systems.
Much of our discussion of Android so far has focused around the activity class and things that users see and interact with through that class. Things like fragments, user interface classes, maps, and touchable views. But handheld applications also include other things that are less visible, but nonetheless very important. For example, we've talked about broadcast receivers, a fundamental Android component that sits in the background, listening for and responding to events. And there are also content providers, another fundamental Android component that allows inter-application data sharing. The fourth fundamental Android component is the service class. Services are designed to support longer-running operations that are usually not visible to the user. Things like downloading large data files from the network, or synchronizing on-device information with a network server. In this lesson, I'll begin by giving an overview of the service class. Next, I'll talk about how you implement simpler services that can be started by clients. And after that, I'll finish up by talking about how you implement more complex services that clients can bind to and then interact with. As I said, services do not interact directly with users, so they have no user interfaces. Services have two main uses. First, they allow you to perform work in the background, even if the service's application terminates. Second, services allow code in one process to interact with code in another process. And as I mentioned earlier, components that want to use a service but don't need to directly interact with it can start that service by calling the context class's startService method, passing in an intent associated with that specific service. Once started, the service can run in the background indefinitely. Although, like any component, Android can kill a service if it needs that service's resources. Started services are usually designed to perform a single operation, after which they terminate themselves without transferring any results back to the component that started them. And by default, services run in the main thread of their hosting application. So, depending on how you implement and use this service, you may need to create a separate thread on which the service can do its work. In contrast, components that want to use a service but do need to directly interact with it can bind to that service by calling the context class's bindService method, passing in an intent associated with a specific service, a service connection object which implements callback methods once the client is connected to and disconnected from the service, and any flags that control the behavior of the binding operation. Binding to a service allows a component to send requests to and receive responses from a service running in the same process or in a different process. At binding time, if the service is not already started, it will be started, and once bound, the service will continue running as long as at least one client remains bound to it. So here's my device. Now I'll start the local logging service application. As you can see, this application displays a single button labeled Generate Log Message. When I click this button, a service will be started, and that service will write a message to the log. Let me hit that button now. Let's take a look at the log console to see the message. So here's my IDE. Let me open the Logcat view. Here you can see a log message that was written by the local logging service application. Let's look at the source code for this application. Here's the application open in the IDE. Let me start by opening up Logging Service Client class. In onCreate, this code first creates an intent that will be used to start the logging service object. Next, the code adds the message to be logged as an extra to the start service intent. And lastly, the code calls the start service method, passing in that intent. Now I'll open up the logging service class. This class extends intent service. The intent service is started by the system, and thereafter it queues incoming intents and then hands them off one at a time to the onHandleIntent method. In this case, that method simply writes the incoming message to the log. Our next example application is called Music Player Foreground Service. With this application, a client activity starts a service that plays a music file. The service plays the music in what's called the foreground state, and that means that the service will be doing something that the user will be aware of, and therefore Android should refrain from killing this service if the system gets low on memory. In addition, like any service, the music playing service will keep playing even if the client activity pauses or terminates. Let's watch this application run. So here's my device. Now I'll start the Music Player Foreground Service application. As you can see, there are now two buttons shown on the display. The top one is labeled Start Service, and the bottom one is labeled Stop Service. Pressing these buttons starts or stops a service that is hosted by this application. Let me start by pressing the Start button. And as you can hear, when I press the Start button, music started playing. You'll also notice that there's now a notification up in the status bar. Now I'll back out of this application. And even though I've killed the application, you can see that the service is still playing the music. Now I'll pull down on the notification drawer and click on the notification view, which restarts the application. And now I'll press the Stop Service button, which, as you can hear, stops the service and stops the music that it was playing. Let's look at the source code for this application. Here's the application open in the IDE. Let me start by opening up Service Music Service Client. In OnCreate, this code first creates an intent that will be used to start the music service. Next, the code sets up listeners for the Start button and for the Stop button. The Start button and listener calls the Start Service method, passing in the music service intent. And the Stop button calls the Stop Service method, also passing in the same music service intent. So let's switch over and take a look now at the Music Service class. Here in OnCreate, this code begins by setting up a new media player. It also attaches an OnCompletion listener to the media player, which will stop the service when the music finishes playing. Next, the code creates a notification area notification so that the user can exit the music player service client, but still have a way to get back to the client in order to shut down the music player. Continuing down, the code calls the Start Foreground method, which puts this service in a foreground state so that it's less likely to be killed if the system needs more resources. Next, the code overrides the onStart command method. This method gets called when a client calls the Start Service command. The code in this method checks to see whether the media player exists, and if so, it then saves the current Start command ID and then makes the media player play the song from the beginning. This method ends by returning a value that tells the system what to do if the service is killed by the system. In this case, that value is start_not_sticky, which means that the system should not automatically restart the service if it gets killed.